My guest is Dr. David R. Montgomery, professor of geology and geomorphology at Washington University. He is author of Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, Growing a Revolution, The Hidden Half of Nature, with his wife, Anne Biklé, who is a biologist. Also with Anne Biklé, their latest book, What Your Food Ate. His books have been translated into 6 languages, including Chinese, Japanese, Korean, German, French, and Spanish. David, how are you today?
I'm fine, Hart. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. I'm happy to have you on. I'm thrilled to have you on because I'm a big fan. So let's get started. David, your latest book with Anne Biklé is What Your Food Ate. What motivated you to write this book?
Boy, well, Anne and I really wrote that book in part because it's an attempt to address some questions that were left over in a way that were naturally brought up through by our previous writing, and that were left in terms of looking at what's the effect of soil health on human health. We've done a lot of work in writing on how farming practices affect the health of the land, how that affected ancient societies in that dirt book, how microbial life is influencing soil fertility in the hidden half of nature, and how regenerative agricultural practices can help revive small scale and large scale farming, and the soil and farming profits. But one of the things that was sort of left on the table after writing those books is, well, what really is the connection between soil health and human health? People have been arguing about this for on 80 years or so, since the early days of organic agriculture and some of the influential writers of the 1930s and 40s. And What Your Food Ate is an my attempt to look into those questions and go, well, how much have we learned in the last 80 years? What are the connections? What are those dots that you can go from how we treat the land to the health of the soil, to the health of our crops, to the health of our livestock, to what gets into our bodies in our food, and how that may influence human health? So it's really a natural extension of the work that Anne and I have been doing for a number of years, looking into these areas. But it was, in great part, an effort to answer those questions to our own satisfaction about how can we really think about those connections, what's solid, what's still a little squishy, and how those dots line up. And it was a lot of fun and very revealing to actually see, well, to basically see the record and then figure out how to tell it in a way where you mix some history along with the science to help the science go down, and see where we've been as a way to forecast where we might go in terms of agriculture in the future and what it might mean for human health.
What is the status of soils in the United States and what should we be doing differently?
Well, if you look at soils, not just at the United States, but even all around the world, there's been significant soil degradation that comes in 2 forms. One is the loss of the topsoil itself. And if you think about how soil erosion works, it works from the top down, and the topsoil is generally the most fertile part of a soil profile. So you lose the best stuff first.
Hmm.
And so there's the loss of the soil. But there's also the loss of soil quality, and that in great part relates to soil organic matter, the carbon content of soils, the amount of once living organisms that are integrated into the soil that are a source of nutrients to support new life that can draw upon those nutrients. And if you look at those 2 different dimensions of the loss of the topsoil and the degradation of soil organic matter and the soil life and the soil health that flows from organic matter, you come up with these sort of different ways of thinking about the state of the soil. In the US, there was a paper that was put out in 2015, I believe it was, in the Journal of Sustainability, that looked at the organic matter changes in the organic matter content, soil carbon content of soils across the US, that concluded that we've reduced our organic matter by about 50%, by about half on most farmland across the US. If we look at in terms of soil erosion, there's estimates that in certain regions, up to half the topsoil has eroded off. Others, like the Piedmont of the American Southeast, from Virginia down into Alabama, almost the whole topsoil A horizon, that really the topsoil has been eroded off that fairly large area. So it depends where you're at as to how much erosion has happened and how much erosion can be tolerated in the future and still be able to farm the land. But there's 2 different dimensions to it. And there's a study that came out in 2020 or 2021 that looked at the topsoil erosion across the whole U.S. Corn Belt and the whole U.S. Midwest. And those 2 studies basically confirmed that we're losing on average about an inch of topsoil every decade. And that's screamingly fast in terms of comparing to how fast soils can be built by natural systems. Um, and if you look at the magnitude of soil organic matter loss, we're again in about 50% level in terms of the total losses. There was a study that looked at again at the Corn Belt that concluded that over fully 1/3 of the area in the U.S. Corn Belt, the entire topsoil has already been eroded off,
Mhm.
and that high yields are basically supported simply by high rates of fertilizer application because
Mhm.
the natural fertility of the soil is shot.
So speaking of fertilizers, are fertilizers bad for the soil?
That's an interesting question. It's got kind of a nuanced answer in the sense that, fertilizers in the broad definition of a fertilizer, well, it helps the soil because things like organic matter, the leaves that trees shed in the fall, are fertilizer for the soil that they
Mhm.
fall on because they then rot and they produce elements that can get back into biological cycling. Where we get into trouble with fertilizers is that the over application of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers in particular is something that is known to accelerate the breakdown of soil organic matter. You get a little burst of productivity, not just from the fertilizer, but also the stimulation of the microbes that the
Mhm.
fertilizer impacts. And that can draw down the batteries of the soil, in effect, draw down the organic matter content. And it also can change the soil community structure. If you look at the life in the soil, if you have a soil that's rich in organic matter versus a soil that's poor in organic matter but gets a lot of fertilizer, you can grow large amounts of crops in both, but you'll have very different communities of life in the soil. And it turns out that that then has a big impact on how things like mineral micronutrients get into plants, or the way that the plants actually tee up their physiological systems to produce things known as phytochemicals, or plant-made chemicals, which they use for their own protection and communication, but that have an influence on human health when they get into our bodies. So if you think of fertilizers in a very general sense, it's kind of agnostic in terms of are they good or bad for the soil. It depends what kind you're using, how much, how often, and in what ways. And in conventional agriculture for the last 80 years, we've been overusing synthetic and soluble nitrogen fertilizers and underutilizing fairly insoluble organic matter fertilizers, which you could think of as sort of traditional fertilizers, manure, crop residue, those kinds of sources of organic inputs that are fertilizers, but
Mhm.
they have very different characteristics. So what is it that is actually, one of the down sides of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, the very soluble ones? Well, you'd think that a good thing for fertilizer would be to make it soluble so a plant will take it up, because you want the
Mhm.
fertilizer to get in a plant if you're using it as a farmer, right? But what that also means is that if it rains right after you've put your fertilizers out, it's soluble. It goes where the water goes. So
Mhm.
down to the water table, to somebody's water well, or off to a stream to pollute the rivers, streams, and ultimately the Gulf of Mexico and the downstream end of the Mississippi River. Um, at fully half of the nitrogen we apply as synthetic fertilizers in conventional agriculture today never makes it into a crop. So it never makes it into a person, never makes it into a
Mhm.
crop. It ends up as off-farm water pollution. So there's a lot of issues around there, but there's a certain efficiency to the natural processes of organic matter breakdown that's like a drip filter of nutrients. It's a different way to think about a fertilizer. Um, but we've been over plowing and we've been overusing soluble fertilizers in agriculture for quite some time. And that has had effects on soil organic matter and life in the soil in ways that have uh, impacted what our crops are able to take up. And that impacts not only their health, but impacts what gets into our food as well.
Speaking of plowing, is plowing bad? Because we have positive associations of the plow. The plow, the farmer does the plow, the farm yields food for us. So we have positive associations and feelings about plowing, but is plowing bad?
Yeah, that's a great question too. It's a little bit like the answer I gave you on fertilizers, where it kind of depends. But in general, yes, tillage is bad for the soil and soil health. And when you think about that, how is that? Well, if you have things like mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, fungi that are beneficial to crops because they serve as root extensions for plants, they'll go out and actually get things like phosphorus or zinc out of the soil, bring it back and give it to the plant in an exchange for root drippings, root exudates, which are yeah, things like sugars or fats and proteins. Sounds a lot like food. Plants will
Mhm.
trade essentially food for minerals that they need to build enzymes to help their bodily functions. And fungi are a big connection. Now, what happens when you run a plow through a field that has a fairly dense fungal network? You chop up those fungal networks,
Mhm.
those root extensions for the plants, and it disrupts those symbiotic relationships between soil life and crops. But there are some advantages to plowing, and that is it's great weed control, right? I mean, that's one
Mhm.
of the really big reasons that farmers will use it is it's a great, if you have a field that's full of either last year's crop or a weed and you want a blank slate to plant in, plow it up and you've got a fresh ground to work with. The problem happens if it rains right after you've plowed.
Mhm.
And you've probably all seen examples of that where you get brown runoff coming off fields
Right.
because the ground's no longer clothed in plants. And nature tends to clothe herself in plants. It reduces erosion way down, and it can also help produce organic matter, which makes the soil more fertile, which means you can grow more plants. There's a positive feedback there. Um, but so tillage or plowing is one of those things where if it's done infrequently because it's sort of needed on a you know on a particular year or a particular application, you've got a perennial weed that's gotten established. You need to wipe it out in a field. Plowing once isn't going to do that much damage. But it's the regular application of routine tillage that does a real number on soil and soil organic matter. But again, if you have a context, say you have a small organic farm and you have a neighbor that has a dairy and you're using a whole lot of livestock manure from that dairy to replenish the organic matter on your smaller on your farm, you can probably get away with plowing that regularly and not damage the soil organic matter because you're adding it back in.
Mhm.
But that's really hard to do at large scale,
Mhm.
and especially if they don't have a convenient source of organic matter to draw upon. And that's where frequent routine tillage can really do a number on soil health by both changing the composition of the community of life in the soil and accelerating the decay of soil organic matter, which can leave farmers even more dependent on chemical fertilizers if once they burn through their supply of organic matter, or dependent on what other sources of organic matter that they have. So tillage is one of those things that it's not to be avoided at all costs everywhere at all times, kind of bad, but it is the kind of thing that we probably don't want to rely on all that frequently. So in that case, it's kind of like alcohol.
Right. In moderation.
In moderation, it's probably fine. A little bit every now and then, it helps people socialize, or helps you manage your fields. But a whole lot all the time, and it's completely dysfunctional.
Yeah. What are the characteristics of healthy soil?
Well, there's sort of two things I like to look at in terms of defining characteristics of healthy soil. One is just the soil organic matter content. Now, you can't put a number on, X% organic matter equals Y kind of soil health because it matters where you're at, what kind of context.
Mhm.
A high soil organic matter content in Arizona, for example, would be a pathetic one in Iowa. So,
Mhm.
it really depends where you're at. But you can gauge that in terms of, relationship to a soil's natural soil organic matter content for the climate and the climate and the geology of the region that it would actually be in. Um, but the other way to measure soil health is through soil life. And it gets more complicated when you bring in a measure of soil life because well, how do you measure it? How do you track it? And you can look at microbial respiration, just what's the integrated activity of breathing in and out of life in the soil. That's one way to gauge it. You could also look at the diversity of life in the soil as a measure of soil health. So in effect, healthy soils tend to have an abundance and diversity of life uh, relative to what you would expect for that particular kind of a region. So in terms of measuring it, you'd want to measure soil organic matter and have some measure of the abundance and activity of life in the soil. And there's various measures that have been proposed for how to do that. But those are the two sort of key elements. One of the tricky bits is how do you then interpret that and gauge that relative to the potential for a site? And it gets more complicated when you start looking into that. But it's kind of like human health in that regard. We have a couple simple things we can measure to gauge human health. There's, our body temperature, our oxygen content of our blood, maybe our blood pressure. There's a number of numbers that we can come up with to try and gauge health. But no one of those numbers really tells you about the health of any particular human. It's a much more integrating kind of a thing. And I think soils are similar. You have to gauge it in context, and you have to gauge it from a number of angles in terms of what are the potential effects on it. But if you look at it through that abundance of soil life and soil organic matter as two leading indicators of soil health, there's a lot of unhealthy soil on a lot of farms around the world today. But that can actually, that I think that can be fixed. I think that can be turned around. I don't think it's inevitable that we degrade the land to feed ourselves. We could flip that on its head.
Does soil health affect human health, and how does that work?
That's a great question. I mean, that gets really at the heart of what Ann and I tried to go after in What Your Food Ate. And so we divided the book into 4 sections: how farming practices affect soil health, and how soil health affects crop health, how crop health affects livestock or animal health,
Mhm.
and then how all that integrates up into human health. And at the risk of sort of trying to oversimplify the book, because there's a lot of dots to connect
I
between
want you to
soil health and our
summarize your book in 3 sentences or less.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Um, you know, the there's a couple things that it's pretty clear that agricultural practices influence in the soil that then translate through to differences in what's in our food. And that boils down to things like mineral micronutrients and vitamin contents. How we treat the soil affects those, and we've got we look at the studies that looked at that and synthesized them in the book and did some of our own measurements on that. There's also things called phytochemicals, plant-made chemicals, that chemicals that plants make to do things like protect their own bodies from ultraviolet radiation or to fend off insect pests. When they get into our diet, we tend to think of them as things like antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, things that actually help keep our bodily systems running well. And there's a lot of studies that have looked at how the style of farming or the way we treat the soil impacts the provisioning of phytochemicals, particularly in fruits and vegetables. And then there's also connections in terms of the fat profile of meat and dairy products, where if we look at 100% grass-fed meat and dairy typically has high omega-3 oil content, fat contents, whereas grain-fed meat and dairy tends to have high omega-6 fat contents.
And which one is better, omega-3 or omega-6?
Well, you actually need both in your diet, but the one that we're short on in the Western diet in particular are omega-3s. And that's omega-3s are the reason that doctors will tell you eat more salmon. It's full of omega-3 fats. It's a good fat, it's a so-called healthy fat that really there's studies that have looked at how that helps to prevent chronic illnesses in particular. But it turns out that salmon are not the only good source of omega-3s on the planet. Leafy green plants are as well. And the reason for that is that omega-3 fats are involved in photosynthesis. So the leaves and photosynthetic parts of plants tend to have a lot of omega-3s, not as many as salmon do, but and salmon get them from marine plants that they eat, the plankton in the ocean, right? They're bringing that up. So if you think the closer you are to photosynthesis in terms of the functional part of a plant, the higher the omega-3 content of it is. Omega-6s, on the other hand, are fats that are very rich in seeds and seed oils. And because seeds serve a very different purpose in a plant than does the leafy green parts. Seeds are meant for storage. They're meant for shelf life. They're meant to be consumed later or to help feed a plant in its early growth and fuel the growth. And so when we look at our livestock and meat and dairy products, what those animals ate really captures what those fats are in their diet. And omega-3 and 6 fats are so-called essential fats. We can only get them from our diet. Our bodies can't make them out of other things. So you feed us the ingredients, we can't put it together ourselves. We have to eat them. And so what we eat is what sets what our body has to work with in terms of omega-3s and 6s. And it turns out that what our food ate is, in terms of livestock and meat and dairy products, that sets the fat balance, the abundance and balance of fats. And the bottom line of the omega-3 and 6 thing, it seems to me, that, and to Anne, that what you want is a diverse abundance. You want sort of a balance between the two, but you need enough of them for them to serve the purposes they do in your body. And omega-6s, when they in the human body, are an integral part of initiating the process of inflammation, whereas omega-3s are integral to the process of ending or quelling inflammation. And you want your body to be able to get inflamed when it needs to. You cut your finger in the kitchen and it turns red as your body is fighting off the bacteria that are getting in off the knife. You want inflammation to work in that case. But you want it to stop when it's over. And there's a lot of chronic diseases that are
Mhm.
affecting more and more people in the U.S. today that are rooted in inflammation that has some tie to diet. And so that's where the omega-6 and 3 balance and portfolio really comes in our diet, is that we want our bodies to be provisioned with what it takes to start inflammation, but we also need them to be provisioned with what it takes to shut it off and turn it down. And if we have a diet that is awash in omega-6 fats, then that's what our body has to work with.
Mhm.
And those omega-6 and 3 fats share a lot of biochemical pathways in the human body. So
Mhm.
if our diet is 20 to 1 omega-6 versus omega-3s, we've really helped our body start inflammation, and we're really challenging it in terms of turning it off. And that could be at the root of many chronic diseases. It's not the omega-6 to 3 thing is not the only thing that influences those,
Mhm.
obviously. Um, there's a lot of things that influence the health of an individual human being.
Mhm.
There's, what we choose to eat. There's whether we get any exercise. There's, our family genetics, what we're born with. Those things all have a huge impact. But what Ann and I argue in What Your Food Ate is that there's another dimension in terms of provisioning our bodies with what it takes to actually help manage and prevent chronic illnesses in the long run, that looking at the diet of our food, what our food ate, or looking at how we raise our food is a relatively overlooked dimension of that. Because in the nutritional sciences, people tend to look at the provisioning of the basic nutrients we need to grow and to survive. And there doesn't seem to be, as far as Ann and I can tell, huge differences in those, but based on how we farm in terms of the macronutrients. A tomato is kind of a tomato, but the flavor of that tomato is strongly influenced by how we farm, as I'm sure people have noticed in terms of their own tomato eating. And it turns out that those flavors in whole natural foods are related, give our bodies clues as to the micronutrient and phytochemical and fat profile and amino acid profiles
Mhm.
of the kind of food that we're eating. And all these kind of connections, a lot of this is fairly recent science, and we've tried to synthesize that in the book to try and make it digestible for people who,
Mhm.
don't happen to read in 4 or 5 different, disciplinary journals the way that we had to actually research the book.
So a couple.
We've got
Couple-
automatic lights here at the UW. If I sit still long enough, I get in the dark.
I know you have to wave at them.
Yeah, but it works.
Um, so a couple of related questions. Well, let me just ask, um, does the quality of the soil affect plant health? And, can plants be more resilient and more nutritious as a result of growing in healthy soil?
Yeah, the you can think of the life in the soil that plants will help to recruit by putting exudates out into the soil, those fats and sugars and proteins to feed life in the soil. They're not doing that just to be nice to the microbes. They're
Mhm.
doing it because they get something in return. And what they've essentially done is they've offshored a lot of their healthcare system, as well as their digestion. You think about, where does a plant digest its food? Well, out in the soil around its roots. It's the microbes out in the soil that are doing the role for a plant of what our own microbiome
Mhm.
does in our own gut. We're just sort of, our digestive system and those of a plant are just inside out relative to each other. And but so the you can think of a healthy, fertile soil that's provisioned with a community of organisms that are engaged in symbiotic relationships with the plants. That's essentially part and extension of the plant's healthcare system, of its ability to care for itself. Because some of those microbes in the soil will make growth hormones for plants. Things that are very specialized for certain kinds of plants, and certain kinds of microbes will do that. It's every bit as evolutionarily honed as the relationships between, say, pollinators and flowers in the garden that we can actually all see with our senses. But what's happening below ground is out of sight, out of mind, and what Anne and I call the hidden half of nature.
Mhm.
And so we don't tend to appreciate it so much. But those relationships are happening there, and they do bolster the health of crops. So if you look at crops grown in healthy, fertile soil, they tend to have lower pest pressure, lower disease pressure. They're more resilient. A life-filled soil that has a lot of organic matter will be more climate resilient because it can hold more water and hold on to it longer, so plants can actually get at it. So there are connections there in terms of crop health. And the way that those translate into human health are through the provisioning of the mineral micronutrients, the vitamins, phytochemicals, things that, we don't need a lot of in our diet, but we need more than we're getting today. And those are all things that can be affected by how we treat the soil, and it can cascade up into what's getting into our bodies as well. And primarily, the connection we think is for the prevention and maintenance of chronic diseases.
What are some of the nutrients that are missing in our food? If we go to the grocery and get conventionally grown vegetables, fruit, meat, what are some of the nutrients that are low in our diet that could be better if we ate, plants that are grown in healthy soil and animals that eat healthy plants, that kind of thing?
Well, the one that's near the top of the list, go back to that omega-6 and omega-3 thing for folks who consume meat and dairy products. The uh, if you look at the average Western diet today, it's about a 10 to 20 to 1 ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s in conventionally raised food. That's a big imbalance. If you look at wild game, for example, it's close to 1 to 1. The ancestral human diet, when we first started
Hmm.
eating meat,
Hmm.
tens of thousands of years ago,
Hmm.
we were eating meat that had a roughly 1 to 1 balance of omega-6s and to omega-3s. If you look at regeneratively raised beef and pork, we can get that ratio down to, the best I've seen is about 1 to 1, just like wild game. But the 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1 are common ratios for that. And the studies on the from the dietary fields have basically would recommend a ratio of 4 to 1 or so as healthy for people. So it's not like we have to have a perfect balance between omega-6s and 3s, but getting 20 times the omega-6s to the omega-3s, that's imbalanced.
Hmm.
And why is our diet so rich in them now? Well, processed food is a big piece of that because a lot of seed oils are used in processed food production.
Hmm.
And seeds, as we'll recall, are rich in omega-6s. And then a lot of our conventional beef and dairy is fed, seed-derived feeds, which means
Hmm.
they're awash in omega-6s as well, which is at the heart of many of the feedlot diseases that one sees plaguing animals in confined animal feeding operations, and that don't tend to affect as many animals that are pasture raised. So the omega-6 to 3 thing is a big one. There's also been a number of studies that have looked at the declining in mineral abundance, and particularly mineral micronutrients, things like copper and zinc, although some of the major elements people have looked at declines in as well since the Second World War when people started measuring these things. And there's a number of explanations that have been offered for, what has contributed to the declining mineral content of foods. Crop breeding has certainly been one of them that where we've bred crops for high yield, but if they're taking up the same amount, say a wheat plant's taking up the same amount of iron from the soil because the roots are just like they used to be, but they're putting twice as many seeds out, well, then they're spreading that iron through twice as many seeds. Each seed gets half the iron. So that translates directly into a reduction in our diet. If we eat the same amount of wheat, we're getting half the iron. And some of those studies are fairly controversial in terms of their net effects. Anne and I reviewed a lot of them for What Your Food Ate. And what we came away with was that there doesn't seem to be consistently huge evidence for big differences in the macronutrients, the things we need to grow and survive, that we basically build our bodies out of. But there have been big losses in a lot of the things that help provide functionality to our health, the health of our bodies, through mineral micronutrients and vitamins and phytochemicals. The other thing uh, that conventional food production has definitely reduced in our crops are things like beta carotene and the lycopene in tomatoes and things that relate to antioxidant and anti-inflammatory activity, which there's people in the medical profession who have theories about how that can add up over a lifetime to essentially blossom into chronic diseases as we've sort of we've deprived our bodies of many of the compounds that we need to maintain our health rather than to build our bodies and maintain our survival. So when we look at sort of nutrition and what's been changed over the last 80 years, a first question to ask is, well, what do you mean by a nutrient? Is it the stuff we need to grow and survive, or does it also count all kinds of non-caloric compounds that don't contribute to the energetics of running our bodies, but are more like, say, the oil for a car that you really need to keep the engine running? You also need oil. You run an engine and combustion engine long enough without adding oil, you're going to get in trouble. And you can think of the phytochemicals and mineral micronutrients as that similar kind of compounds for the human body that help take out the trash, help do the maintenance on a cellular level in our bodies, and keep us functioning as well as we can for as long as we can.
Fantastic. Why is it important to have diverse cover crops or diverse plant communities in the ground? Does that help build soil when you have a diversity of plants?
Yeah, so the three elements of regenerative farming that are sort of a good system for helping to rebuild soil fertility fairly quickly are minimizing disturbance. So that would be no-till and minimal tillage and minimal chemical use. It's keeping cover crops planted at all times in between your cash crops, whether it's in a rotation or in between rows, depending what style of farming you like to do. And then also growing a diversity of crops. And the diversity part comes in really in two ways. And one way is that if you keep planting the same crop in the same field over and over, what you've done is you've created a grocery store for pests. So if a pest reproduces in that field and its next generation is born into a field that is all what it loves to eat, they're going to be happier than you are. And that increases the demand then for pesticides to manage them. And so what happens when you actually use a broad spectrum pesticide on a field? Basically, if it wipes out all insects, which come back first? The pests or what used to prey on those pests, the predators? The hint is it's not the predators. You think about those great experiments, there's natural experiments with deer colonizing an island, and the wolves show up later. If the wolves take too many deer, the deer population crashes, and then the wolf population crashes. And the wolves aren't going to come back before the deer do. The prey have to come back first before the predators do, so there's something for the predators to eat. Insects are no different in a field. So if we wipe out all the insects, and by many estimates, there's something on the order of like 1,000 different insect predator species for every major agricultural pest. There's a lot of predators out there potentially that could manage insect pests. But if we wipe them out with broad spectrum pesticides, we just set the table for the pests coming back first. And then if we keep nuking them, the predators never get reestablished, which means you're hooked on the pesticides. So there's diversity in that sense. But also when we think about the exudates, those compounds that plants and crops are exuding out of their roots to build partnerships with life in the soil, different plants will exude different exudates. And when you think about how you build a resilient community of life in the soil that's capable of interacting with lots of different plants to build soil health, I like to think of it along the lines of a baseball team. If you had a baseball team that was all catchers, are you going to win the World Series? No, you're not. There may not be a pitch that ever makes it past home plate to the backstop because you'll have really good catchers, but that's not what a team makes. And so you can think about diversity as essentially microbial teamwork of building a resilient community of organisms to partner with and to interact with. And diversity diversity of what we eat actually translates into good advice on the human health end as well, for comparable reasons around what goes on in our own gut.
So you wrote Hidden Half of Nature with your wife, Anne Biklé, and it's a story about y'all getting into your own yard and starting with a rather degraded landscape, and then You built it up over time. What did you learn from that?
Boy, well, the key thing that I learned from that was really how fast you can rebuild soil fertility if you do the right things. I had the good fortune to marry a biologist. And so, as a geologist, I'm pretty good at the mineral part of soils.
Mhm,
The living part, it's like, okay, I can learn about it, but she's a biologist.
mhm,
And so when we bought a house in Seattle where we live, I teach at the University of Washington here. When we bought that house, we had a side yard that was basically 6 inches of grass. It was tangled grass roots. The Norwegians couple that we had owned the house for decades before us were definitely not gardeners. So we had this big old growth lawn. We pulled the lawn off so that Anne could make the garden that she'd always dreamed of having. When we were living in grad student housing, there was no opportunity to do that kind of stuff. And we had this just horribly crappy soil. It was khaki colored. There was no organic matter in it, very, very little organic matter in it. There wasn't a single worm that we found in the lawn, in the ground when we pulled the lawn off. She basically started composting and mulching because she realized that what we needed was organic matter. We had the mineral part of soil, but we didn't have the living part. We didn't have the life or the remains of life, the organic matter part. And so basically, what I learned watching her restore life to our yard, as we wrote about in the Hidden Half, was that if we have the mineral part of the soil already there, so we haven't completely lost all the soil, we're not down to bedrock. If we still have soil to work with, the quality of that soil can be enhanced really fast by bringing the biology back, by bringing the microbial life back. And by really fast, I mean we went from about 1% organic matter up to pushing 10% organic matter in our yard in about a decade. So and that's a really fast pace for changing something as basic as the soil to go. It's like going from 0 to 100 in a couple of years, really fast. Um, so that opened my eyes to thinking about, oh, well, if we could do it in a garden, could you do it on a farm? What
mhm,
would it take to do it on a farm? And it turned out that there's people who've already done it on farms all over the world
mhm. Right.
through adopting these regenerative farming practices. And that's what I did in writing Growing Our Evolution, as I
Mhm.
went around to visit some of the farmers whose work I had become aware of, who had done to their farms what Anne had done to our yard. And my job was to basically interview them and ask, okay, how did you do this? And then try and look at from the 20,000 foot level of what are the commonalities that farmers in, subsistence farmers in equatorial Africa were using, or in Costa Rica and coffee country, or in the Dakotas on big ranches in the US, or on fairly large family farms in Ohio. It turns out that that combination of minimal disturbance, no-till, and cover crops and a diversity of crops really was a fairly universal recipe for building healthy, fertile soils. But the actual practices people would use, those were all really different.
Hmm.
And so that's what got me interested in thinking about what are the commonalities that could be lessons that we would learn in agriculture about what's the way forward to an intensive agriculture that might feed the world, but also enhance the fertility of the land and cut down on our use of fossil fuels, cut down on our use of chemical fertilizers, um, and make small farms more profitable again. Those are all
And
potential
they become
advantages.
more profitable because you use less inputs, right? Your productivity can be comparable, but you're spending less on inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, and water.
Yeah, and that's what really turned me into an optimist on this issue was in visiting farmers for writing Growing a Revolution, how successful they had been not only at restoring their soil, but at restoring profitability to what had been fairly degraded farms. And it was exactly as you were just saying, that what they were able to maintain their harvests while greatly reducing their input costs. Now, there can be a transition period where harvests could go down initially, because if you
Mhm.
go straight from using a whole lot of agrochemical supplements to not using many at all, you can drive your yields down pretty fast. And so there can be an art to how to
Mhm.
navigate the
Right.
transition. But I was really surprised at how short that transition can be of, just a year to 3 years, that kind of a window, for not only getting the profitability back, but getting yields back up to comparable to conventional neighbors. And many of the farmers I've talked to more recently since writing that book, who've sort of gone and adopted this full system of regenerative farming, or a regenerative style of farming. People still argue about what the word regenerative means as well. But the folks who had adopted the kind of farming that I've been talking about had been able to become that their profitability really didn't even decline, because in the first year they so reduced their input costs that even with taking a hit on their yield, they were still came out at the better bottom line.
Right. Yeah, Gabe Brown's story is such that he, had fell on hard times for 4 years in a row and couldn't afford the inputs. So that's why he was forced into a transition.
Yeah, and it's a lot of the early adopters of what we would now call regenerative agriculture had similar kinds of economic crises that drove them to do something different. They weren't able to continue what they had been doing before, and they landed on a system of minimal disturbance and then ultimately cover crops and diversifying their cover crops that led to that full combination of three principles. Um, but that, it's challenges, crises can be real opportunities for change. And we've seen in the last year or so, since the Russians invaded Afghanistan, the price of fertilizer hasn't gone down. Access to global wheat supplies hasn't increased. There's been some real challenges to the global agricultural system that highlight how vulnerable we are to relying on synthetic inputs that are centralized in terms of their production, and how vulnerable we are as a species on relying for the majority of our caloric input, the energy that runs our bodies, to for just a few simple grains.
Absolutely. So that's about all the questions I have, but I wanted to ask you for parting thoughts, words of wisdom, or what would you like to see happen in the world? What would you like to see change? Maybe part of that question is, are you aware of people who are kind of helping farmers make the transition from a system that doesn't really work for anybody to one that, we could make the transition, but what would you like to see happen?
Yeah, well, there are a number of individuals and firms that are advising folks on how to make the transition, who I think are doing actually a pretty good job of things. There's a group in the United States, Understanding Ag,
Right.
that Gabe Brown's involved with.
Mhm.
There's groups in Europe that are doing that. I've just been approached by a group in Asia that's starting to thinking about and doing that. So there are people out there offering advice on that, and advice on how to rebuild life in the soil. Elaine Ingham, for example, is a
Mhm.
consultant who does just amazing work with soil life. And so there's a growing cadre of people who are engaged in actively advising farmers on what specifically to do on their farm. There's a lot that needs to be developed and promoted in those regards through agricultural extension services and other areas that really need to be doing more work along these lines. Um, there's, in terms of where I'd like to see things going, well, the biggest picture is I'm really hoping that what we're starting to see with the broader adoption of soil health building farming practices is what I like to call the fifth agricultural revolution, which is looking at rethinking our style of agriculture to prioritize and promote practices that build soil health as the foundation for what we consider to be good farming. That the care we take for the land is actually would be the fundamental way that we evaluate farming practices.
Mhm.
And I think that we could get there. It may take 20 or 30 years. It's not going to happen overnight. There's a lot of education that needs to happen. And frankly, there's a lot of incentive structures in agricultural
Mhm.
policies and programs that need to shift to better align with giving farmers the incentive and ability to actually work on improving the health of their soil. Because farmers are caught in a pretty complicated policy space and very real economic spaces that don't always line up in terms of favoring adopting these more regenerative practices. I think, though, that those things are starting to come more in line, and I'd love to see some action at the policy level to try and
Mhm.
incentivize farmers and help farmers make the transition to regenerative practices. I'm not a big fan of restricted regulations. I'm a much bigger fan of
Mhm.
trying to look at where the incentives lie for people, because we're actually pretty good at following incentives as individuals.
Mhm.
You know, we're good at figuring out what that best way
Mhm.
forward is in the context that we're living in. And unfortunately, we've set up our agricultural system at a governmental and policy level and a basic economic level in ways that encourage people to continue farming in a style that degrades the land. I would love to see that change so that we reward farmers for taking better care of their land in a way that translates into a better livelihood for them.
Absolutely. David, it's been a wonderful conversation. I want to remind our listeners to go get your books wherever books are sold. Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, Growing a Revolution, The Hidden Half of Nature, and What Your Food Ate. The latest is What Your Food Ate. It's everything you've ever wanted to know about nutrition, but we're afraid to ask. and how the nutrition comes from healthy soil through the plants and animals, that kind of thing.
Well, Hart, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.